Our guests today are Mahmoud Mohideen, Senior Vice President of the World Bank Group, and Georgia Petkowski, who is a Senior Fellow at the Wharton Zicklin Center for Business Ethics. Mahmoud and Georgia, thank you so much for joining us today at Knowledge at Wharton.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Very happy to have you here with us today.
Always
in
a pleasure
Philadelphia.
to be with you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So, Mahmoud, let's start with you. At the recent Washington, D.C. meetings of the spring meeting of the World Bank and the IMF, the new World Bank Group President, David Malpass, said that more than 700 million people around the world are still mired in extreme poverty. I wonder, what is the thinking at the World Bank and the IMF about creating jobs and increasing the median incomes for people who are so poor?
Well, the figures shared by the president of the World Bank are based on the latest update on poverty and inequality that was published a few months ago by the World Bank Group. So this is the latest figures based on the information obtained from different countries. And it seemed that we are up to a very big challenge, especially if we put in consideration the fact that heads of state and country leaders agreed back in 2015 to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030. So we only have 11 years to go. The success of halving the number of the poor under the Millennium Development Goals have been very much attributed to a great success by different countries in achieving higher growth that enabled better jobs, higher incomes, especially in countries like China and India. Now the struggle is that in countries in Africa and other low-income countries are not really growing sufficiently. The only thing that is growing steadily is the population. And in order to cope with the challenges, you need really to invest in human capital, you need to invest in infrastructure, and you need to invest in decent systems of social protection to deal with the shocks as well, either economic shocks or natural disasters. The kind of growth that we have been seeing during the last couple of years needs really to be changed. We have been in decline. The World Bank and the IMF have been revising down their estimates for growth for this year, 2019, and for the upcoming 2 years until 2021. In order to deal with the challenges of extreme poverty, especially in Africa, you need to have growth figures exceeding 6% in a steady, continuous way. And this is basically, again, emphasizing the importance of investments.
Georgia, based on what Mahmoud just said, if the world economy has to grow at more than 6%, especially to deal with problems of extreme poverty, what do you think are some of the solutions to how that can be made to happen?
I mean, first challenge is we measure growth through GDP and how much that really capture the quality of and cost of the growth. So we might have a short-term growth, but not necessarily on the sustained level. And the same thing is related to job creation. Because first of all, to acknowledge the fact that most of the people who don't have jobs are young people. And then it's not just the question of creating growth so that they can get employed. The question is, do they have the relevant knowledge to get employed? So this is usually neglected. And second is the quality of the jobs and whether through jobs they also have opportunities to improve their knowledge, learning opportunities so that they can not just stay on the same jobs, but also help the economy to go in the right direction.
Now, Mahmoud, at the same spring meetings, you actually led a panel discussion on the Sustainable Development Goals and the need for countries to integrate into their national budgets some of the targets that countries are setting in that regard. Why is that so important? And are there some countries that you think are doing a better job than others in that respect?
Well, this discussion is very much based on the Finance for Development agenda and the discussion that started back in July 2015 in Addis. So we're not saying anything new, but what's new is the emphasis on taking matters related to finance more seriously than have been taken so far. And I like to draw a picture of finance like a river with many sources, public, private, domestic, and external. And in order for that river to give you the required water for life and development, all sources need really to be active. And there are no substitutes here because there are huge requirements for funding the SDGs. Without budget, you cannot really do a good job with the private sector. Private sector would require discipline, would require to know to what extent the government is crowding its activities in or crowding them out. So the budget is not just about figures, it's basically about signaling and about incentives and about direction. And unfortunately, many countries, when they talk about the future agenda for development or the 2030 agenda, they only talk in a very generic way, very general way. They don't attach costs and they don't attach spending priorities to that kind of work. I've come across very good examples recently by countries at the state level, like in India and Bangladesh. I've seen some good work at the country level and at the state level, like in Colombia. Vietnam and China have been masters of long-term planning, so issues related to strategies, plans, and budgets comes naturally in the system. But at the end of the day, it's all about implementation as well. So you need really to get the finance, public and private, right. You need to put the environment to encourage collaboration and business, linking it to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and getting as local as you can in terms of implementation, what we call localization of the SDGs, which is very different, by the way, from the old debate about centralization versus decentralization. It's a completely different new system that respects the priorities and the comparative advantages of the local communities.
Let's drill deeper into this question of implementation, because that is so critical. What are some of the, in your experience, some of the barriers to implementation that have existed in the past, and what can be done now to overcome those barriers?
Right. I think the work that we are pushing now towards more localization is based on the experience of the Millennium Development Goals, which ended in 2015. And in joint work with the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP, and the World Bank, we found out that the difference between failure and success is basically the delivery where it matters. At the end of the day, all of these development goals mean better life, better services, better support to individuals and human beings wherever they are. And they are located either in urban areas, in cities and districts, or they are living in rural areas. So as far as we have seen by evidence, if the focus is only centralized, and assuming that there is going to be some magic coming out from a trickle-down effect, that one didn't really work. For countries that achieved better results when it comes to education, health services, better transport, these are the countries that have managed to factor in the local priorities, engaging the communities in setting the priorities, because under budget constraints, you cannot really do everything at the same time. So better to engage the local communities who know better what they need. And then you can always put the standards, put the means of competition, and have a kind of a national mapping, not to be very much focused on the local matters, but basically to have a kind of a competition, a leash between the different governors, different cities, in order to achieve the goals. We have seen some good examples of that. One very positive example I would refer to is from Colombia again. This is a country that had been really facing trouble for many years, civil war included, drug trafficking, all kinds of tensions in the society were there. During the last couple of decades, they transformed themselves to become now an OECD country. This is the club of the richest countries in the world. That didn't really happen by leaving matters to time to solve, but basically about good policies, good institutions, and great deal of localization.
So, Georgia, just to build upon what Mahmoud just said, what can other countries learn from the example of countries like Colombia, which seem to have figured out how to sort of overcome some of the challenges?
Well, I think that the localization is also about understanding the need of the local communities, but at the same time signaling entrepreneurship, because if you are challenging the resources to address the real needs, then there is a real demand. And if there is demand, then you have entrepreneurship to support that. The other is also talking about the budgetary allocations. It's also important to look at which portion of the budget can be leveraged by bringing the private sector. This will not happen just by saying we would like to engage the private sector, but the policy really to address the gap which exists between the commercial immediate interests of the corporate sector in addressing some of these issues which are not immediately awarded by the market. So I know that the World Bank Group is doing a lot in the context of blended finance. Yes. That's the contribution from the World Bank, but that kind of innovative thinking is also needed from the government side. So when they do the budgeting thing. So that's one thing. The other is that the more you have direct knowledge exchange between countries without intermediaries, the better. I mean, it's good that the World Bank is taking lead on that for many years now. Knowledge at Wharton as well. We need that. But it's also, we need to have that more complementary engagement where the country will learn from each other without filtering that. And I would also argue that young people can play a tremendous role in that. One of my students from the last semester who was doing something on homelessness in Philadelphia, during the winter break, she went to Bangalore to look at how they address the issue of homeless in Bangalore. And now when she came for this semester, she started implementing some of this idea. And you have the other things. Another student of mine this semester, with a few of his colleagues, developing a new model of addressing issue of health care for low-income people in the United States, suddenly said, well, maybe our concept can be equally relevant for Africa. Yeah. But engaging in Africa, they also get sufficient information to revise their thinking of how to do it in Philadelphia. So this whole knowledge exchange thing is very kind of holistic, and there are different ways, and this is what we need to support.
I'm so glad that both of you mentioned both entrepreneurship and innovation as important ways of dealing with these issues. Because that's takes me to the next point, Mahmoud, that I wanted to bring up with you. In reading some of your writings, I know that you have been saying that in the past, billions of dollars of investment were required. Now it is trillions. And to address the gaps between the resources that will be needed to implement the Sustainable Development Goals and what resources are available today. What sorts of innovative financing solutions do you think have you been seeing that allow people to solve this, to bridge that gap?
Yes, what triggered the discussion of the billions to trillions? This is the phrase that we used to promote more private sector, public sector kind of innovative solutions. With basically the fact that some estimates, when you aggregate all of the funding gaps in different countries to achieve the 17 goals, the gaps were estimated or could be guesstimated to be around $4 to $6 trillion. You can see even the gap in the estimates because of lack of data and information. Right. More recently, only in 5 areas of the Sustainable Development Goals, education, health, and 3 areas of infrastructure like water and transport and energy. The estimates of the International Monetary Fund tell us of a gap of around $2.6 trillion. these big figures perhaps may need to be translated at the country and the local level. And again, you'll find these gaps. At the end of the day, you'll see that these trillions of gaps are really part of a bigger story, this bigger story that we have in the global system today, more than $100 trillion of available funds and assets. Many of them, many of such assets are with negative yield or with zero return. So here it's basically how to encourage such funds to take perhaps more risk, but more calculated risk, with the help and partnership with different agencies, including the World Bank and the regional development banks, and get part of this great availability of funds to where priorities of development are. This will not really flow directly, but they need to be incentivized. They need to have better business environment, governance, rule of law, and pipelines of projects. And this is basically the kind of partnership that the World Bank has with many of the countries, that we don't just do transactions. In many cases, we are required by countries to help in improving business climate and the pipeline of financeable projects. Having said that, I think we need to deal with all of these gaps together. I mentioned the gaps on finance, and there is a gap of implementation that we discussed, and there is a gap of data as well. Yeah. And the gap of data is responsible for lots of the mess that we are seeing in terms of lack of funding in many countries because of lack of knowledge. Many investors may be just guided by perception. Part of that perception might be wrong or suffering from prejudice. The only way to do it or to fix the problem is to provide better information. It could be worse than what they think, and in many cases, as we have seen it in Africa, for instance, is much better in terms of a decent return to risk mix. But what we need is basically more updated information. And part of the discussion that we're doing with the business community as one of the PRs or the permanent representatives to the UN, the ambassador of Canada, mentioned that we need to be all bilingual. I would say that we need to be multilingual. So the government needs to understand the language of the private sector. And at the same time, both they need to understand the language of community or society. And this requires patience, interpretations, better interpretation, and not to live in these kind of isolated silos.
Right. Georgia, coming back to the point you raised earlier about entrepreneurship, I wonder if you have any thoughts on how entrepreneurship can be used to help in achieving sustainable development goals, especially among women entrepreneurs, even say at the bottom of the pyramid. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, we have been working together, the Ziegler Center, Wharton, and the World Bank for already 5 years with the Ideas for Action for Young Entrepreneurs. And relatively recently, we have another program on SDGs and her.
This is the offspring.
Yes, this is a phenomenal learning experience also for us because there's really direct interaction with the entrepreneurs. Also, they are understanding more and more it's not just sufficient to have a good business model and to have a good startup. That part of the work they need to do is to help also shaping the business environment in which they operate. That also create kind of confidence for that. Corporations should follow the same philosophy. Sometimes they say we don't go in fragile states because they are fragile, there is no institutions, the risk is high. Yes, maybe the risk is high because also of their old business models. New business model, new business thinking also help them to be part of building these institutions. And we have a good example with one of our partners, Firmenich, when they decided to make investment in Uganda vanilla production. They understood they have to build partnerships. They cannot do it on their own. And this is where the local engagement, particularly in case of vanilla, women are the main producers, and the more they are engaged in that, the more stronger social cohesion is in that environment, will be made much easier for other companies to come. So we shouldn't measure, the success of this initiative, like engaging women entrepreneurs, just on the base how many new businesses have started, but how through that engagement new space has been created, also encouraging companies to come, to take them as a part of the supply chain and so on. So I think the experience so far has been tremendously positive.
I'm very glad that you mentioned Uganda, because that reminded me that the World Bank has made a very major commitment to Africa. I think $25 billion have been committed to digitalizing Africa, and with a further equal amount to be sourced from the private sector. And I was wondering, Mahmoud, if you could explain what is the strategy here? Why is this so important in reducing extreme poverty?
Well, there is no way for Africa to come out from the traps of poverty and inequality without embracing the good fruits of knowledge and ideas and outcomes of the fourth industrial revolution, which is about how to deal with big data, how to deal with the new platforms of knowledge, including the platforms for transactions as well and commerce, how to understand and have a good command on artificial intelligence. This requires a huge infrastructure. It shouldn't be left to some smart, skillful business people and young people alone. They are doing their part, but there is a great deal of investment that should be done by the public sector, by the private sector, in order to enable these countries to be part of this new world. Talking about the big data and how to store data, retrieve data, and protect them as well from breaching of security or such matters is very big and huge investment. So digitalizing Africa, or what we call the moonshot approach, celebrating half a century since the first man landed on the surface of the moon, is basically to give people hope, but give the people as well some specific measures, as been done by President Kennedy, to give timeline, ambitious target, easy as well to understand and easy to judge as well. So we have these programs of action at different countries in partnerships. We work with all levels of engagement, because it is not just about having the production to be engaged in technology or the finance to be using fintech solutions, but as we were saying before the discussion that we have today, or the interview, that as we are keen to have advances and innovation in finance, for instance, through what's so-called fintech, we need the regulators and supervisors to be aware of the pros and cons, not to complicate the life of the market and investment participants. And we need the government as well to avail the infrastructure, including identification and good rule of law, to the whole thing. In addition to that, we need the society itself, which is the ultimate beneficiary of all of these kind of digitalization and innovation, to be brought up to date with the requirements of the new world, what we called, or what I called, SOCTEC. I hope it is not abusing the acronyms, but basically to simplify what we're talking about. This contribution from the World Bank, the 25 billion, is I wouldn't say a drop in the ocean, but it's a decent contribution to a very demanding sector when it comes to resources.
So to conclude, I have one question for both of you, and that is, what do you see, as you said in the beginning, we are not that far from 2030 now. What do you see as some of the biggest obstacles that exist to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, and what should be done to overcome those obstacles?
Well, at the end of the day, it's a country-level kind of a challenge. So some countries may suffer today from fragility and conflict. So they are busy with other matters. Some countries are very much focused on the short term. From development perspective, you can really consider 2030 as tomorrow. But they are very much busy with what could really help them survive the day, rather than having a kind of a long-term investment in education, health, and the infrastructure, and indeed taking care of the environment and climate. So this is another kind of a challenge. The other challenge could be resources. You could have very sophisticated government and community, but at the same time, public resources are not enough. So that's the list can go on. So that's why we're after this kind of specific tailored approach that understands the pros and cons, the comparative advantages and disadvantages of each country, and try to provide a solution to the requirements. Some countries may not really need the help of the World Bank, like the sophisticated OECD countries, but again, they would benefit from sharing knowledge and putting themselves in this kind of a challenge of competition.
Well, I will focus just on one. Being here at Wharton, of course, the first thing comes to mind is what we need to do about management education. Yes. I think we need a fundamental change there. If the private sector is the sector which creates most of the job, create value, then are we really preparing our students to take the lead in this space? And I think a very serious reflection on that, understanding the challenges of sustainable development goals from one side, the challenges of companies to engage in that, and what are the knowledge gap present there, kind of creative pressure on the professors to reflect on their curriculum, whether we are preparing the students for tomorrow or we are just telling the same story of yesterday. So these are the challenges, and this will not happen until the students themselves get a little bit better organized, better exposed to the sustainable development goals and the challenges there, comparing what knowledge they need to be part of that. And I will conclude with a conversation with my colleague Will Laufer from Wharton. It's about generational responsibility. Mm-hmm. The students has to understand that it's not just our generation, what we can do for them, but what they can do for themselves. And I think that's the key.
Great. Well, Mahmoud, Georgia, thank you so much for joining us today on Knowledge at Wharton.
Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you.
For more insight from Knowledge at Wharton, please visit knowledge.wharton.upenn.edu.